Yes, and I'm recording.
And you're recording. Okay, here we go. Waiting room is opening.
All righty. Thank you all very much for having me. My name is Alejandro Arrieta. I'm going to go ahead and be the interpreter for today. So I'm going to share the instructions for interpretation. I will provide them in Spanish first and then come back and repeat them in English. So thank you for your patience. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Alejandro Arrieta, seré el intérprete el día de hoy. Y como queremos practicar este acceso al idioma, vamos a tener interpretación al español. Si usted prefiere escuchar en español, podrá seleccionar el icono terráqueo que va a aparecer después de las instrucciones. Aparecerá ese terráqueo, es el icono terráqueo en la parte de abajo a mano derecha en su pantalla y tendrán que seleccionarlo para escoger el español y poner el audio original en silencio para que solamente escuchen en el idioma de su corazón. Muchas gracias y voy a mandar esto en escrito en los mensajes de chat por si se les ofrece. All right. So with that, we might have space at the end where we might have both English and Spanish present in this space, and we want to make sure that everybody is able to engage in the language of their heart. So after these instructions, we're going to turn on the interpretation where you're going to see a globe icon appear on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Click on that, select English if that is your preferred language, if you're not bilingual in both English and Spanish. And we should be good and prepared for whatever language is spoken in this space. So with that, I'll pass it over to Christine to turn on the interpretation and then we can get started. Vamos a aprender la interpretación.
Interpretation has begun. Thank you so much.
So good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dina Johnson, and I'm from JFK Partners at the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus. And JFK Partners and the Colorado Title V program collaboratively present a quarterly educational series to address the current Colorado Title V MCH priorities and emerging issues. This series is intended to expand the capacity of the maternal child health workforce and related systems to better serve infants, children, youth, and those with special health care needs and their families. So today's topic is building resiliency and mitigating caregiver burnout. Please feel free to type questions or comments in the chat box at any time. We ask that you please keep your microphone muted so that we do not hear background noise. We are recording today's event and will archive it on the JFK Partners website along with the other webinars in this series. And we will be posting the handout for today, for which you are welcome to print or save for future reference. Following the webinar, you'll receive a link requesting an evaluation. You may request a certificate of attendance in the evaluation. Today's speaker is Courtney Paisley, Dr. Courtney Paisley, and she is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Developmental Pediatrics at Children's Hospital, Colorado. She completed a 2-year post-baccalaureate fellowship at Yale Child Study Center before attending the Child Clinical Psychology PhD program at the University of Alabama. She also completed her internship at JFK Partners from 2021 to 2022. Her own research has focused on the involvement of caregivers in intervention practices and the psychological well-being of caregivers with autistic children. Followed by Courtney's presentation will be a panel, and the panel will be led by Kristen Kaiser. And Kristen Kaiser joined the Joshua School in 2015 as Director of Operations and recently became the Executive Program Director. She is responsible for working closely with the executive director and the director of finance in overseeing operations and budget. Kristen also works closely with the program directors at the 3 campuses overseeing programming. Kristen serves as the LEND Family Discipline Director for JFK Partners, teaching and mentoring multidisciplinary professionals on disability and the family experience. She has spent the past 12 years in autism research, developing and implementing family support, programming for families newly diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Kristen holds a master's in public health from the UC School of Medicine, a BA in English from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an MLA in English and American Literature from Harvard University Extension School. So with that, I will turn things over to Courtney.
Thank you, Dina, for the introduction. And thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Dina, can you see it okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. So as Dina mentioned, the topic today is building resiliency and mitigating parental or caregiver burnout. So I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And the learning objectives today to start is to understand the risk and protective factors for parental burnout, as well as I'll describe differences in burnout and resilience between mothers and fathers of autistic children. And then for the parents and providers here today, I'll identify some tools and recommendations that parents can use themselves or the providers can give to parents who are currently struggling with burnout. I'll start by covering some of the current literature as well as screening measures that can be used. I'll talk about some of my own research findings that I conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'll spend hopefully the majority of time talking about treatment and assessment considerations and then examples of parent-provider collaboration when parents are experiencing burnout or having difficulties building resiliency. So I'll start by talking about burnout. And so what is burnout? For most parents, stress related to parenting is really short-term and does not necessarily have a lasting impact on their life. However, for about 8 to 36% of parents, they report that parenting-related stress can really intensify to the level of burnout. And so a lot of this research has actually been done in Europe and has been expanded a lot more recently in really the last 5 or so years. And they've identified that parental burnout really extends beyond what is categorized as typical parenting stress. And so they define burnout as a prolonged response to chronic and overwhelming parental stress. And so symptoms of burnout may include physical and mental exhaustion, increased physical complaints or feeling like you're sick, decreased sleep quality, feeling emotionally distanced from children, and then really a sense of incompetency or inadequacy in their parenting role, as well as some parents feeling like they're trapped in a situation of parenting with no way out. So we think about parental burnout in terms of it being a mismatch between parent-related demands as in the availability of resources to meet those expectations within the parenting role. So demands are things like risk factors that increase the level of stress, and then resources are thought to be those protective factors that can alleviate stress. So I'll be talking more about both of these. And of course, all parents experience fluctuating demands and varying access to resources throughout life. However, parental burnout is really thought to come about when there's a chronic mismatch between these demands and resources, with greater or longer exposure to demands compared to those resources. So there are three distinct dimensions of burnout that have been identified in research and that can be helpful for parents to understand in kind of thinking about their own experiences. The primary symptom of burnout is emotional exhaustion related to parenting that can result in parents feeling overwhelmed amounts of fatigue at really thinking about facing another day with their child or what's expected of them, in the parenting role coming up. A second symptom is emotional distancing, which results in parents' decreased involvement and kind of a reduction in the number of interactions with their child, such that parenting really becomes more of like a survival mode or performing only the tasks that are necessary rather than having more of that emotional connection. And then the third symptom is a loss of accomplishment related to parenting. So parents may no longer enjoy their role as a parent, or they may feel like totally fed up with parenting, and they're no longer enjoying spending time with their children like they used to. So when thinking about factors or conditions that can lead to burnout, thinking about the pandemic and all of the changes that happened in our world, that was a particularly concerning time given the changes and the increased like sheltering in place requirements, unemployment, financial strain, reduced levels of social support that families were facing, as well as much more limited leisure time or time away from their child when their child was at daycare or school, for example. So although hopefully the worst of the pandemic is behind us, I think we all continue to see the impact. And so I'll talk more about my research that took place during COVID, but I think that's an important factor in thinking about how our surroundings can impact mental health in general. And then research has also shown that parents who have a child with behavioral or emotional or learning disorder, or who have a child with a disability or chronic illness, are at increased risk for burnout. And so thinking today, particularly about parents of autistic children, they may face all of the aforementioned concerns, which really merits heightened consideration and further examination for levels of parental burnout. So of course, it should be recognized that each parent experiences their own unique risk factors. Overall, there's still relatively little knowledge about the contributing factors that lead to parents experiencing burnout, and especially differences between mothers and fathers. And then there's been a lot of mixed findings in terms of how sociodemographics like age or income or number of children in a household can relate to burnout. So thinking about the consequences of burnout, again, this research is relatively new, so little is known compared to other aspects of mental health. But we do know that it can have significant impacts on parents, on couples, and then the children themselves. So in particular, parents who are experiencing high levels of burnout have found to have more addictive behaviors or sleep disorders and experience more suicidal or escape ideation, or wishing that they could remove themselves from their family for a certain amount of time and spend more time away from them or on their own. There's been more conflict found or infidelity in couples who are experiencing burnout. And then also some research has found increased neglect or violence towards children. So in thinking about differences in mothers and fathers, a lot of research looking at parental stress has found that mothers report much higher levels of stress than fathers. However, when looking at burnout, what has been found is that there's actually an equal proportion of mothers and fathers who report burnout. However, there's differences in the factors that lead to burnout, as well as the consequences of burnout for mothers and fathers. So for mothers, it's been found that they actually have a higher level of exhaustion and emotional distancing compared to fathers. And for mothers, really they reach the level of burnout when there's a true imbalance between the demands and resources. So the demands clearly outweigh the resources, whereas for fathers, they've been found to actually burn out earlier, even when the resources were not yet outweighed by demands. So although studies have shown that fathers can be less exposed to parenting responsibilities, fathers actually appeared to be more vulnerable to the parenting demands that they were facing. This may be because mothers are resisting more of the parenting stress, or those who are the fathers are less exposed, but then more vulnerable. And this may have been especially present during COVID and all of these kind of changes in our world. So continuing and thinking about gender differences, many mothers have reported that they tend to feel increased pressure, especially in the society that we live in today, to be a perfect mother. And this may be with social media or a lot of mom influencers on Instagram or Facebook who are sharing their experiences. And so what can be perceived as being a perfect household or parents who have it all together can lead to other parents feeling like more of a push to be perfect. And so there was a study that found that parents who felt more pressured to be perfect actually experienced increased prevention of making mistakes. So really doing everything they can to avoid making any mistake as a mother. And then also increased behavioral regulation. So really trying to be more involved in mothering and controlling or taking on as many of the childcare tasks as they can. And so these findings really highlight how parental burnout may impact parenting, both in the area of childcare as well as behavior towards others. So how a mother treats a father or a spouse. And so thus, in some instances, the pressure of being a perfect mother may really result in the intent to increase involvement and improve the well-being of their child, but in reality may lead to unintentional negative impacts on the child and family. So some potential negative outcomes could be increased depressive symptoms in child or lower overall life satisfaction for the family. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm going to focus from here on out really thinking about parents of autistic children. And much of the parental burnout literature and research has focused on parents of kids with chronic health issues, and so much less in this population. And so there's really been no research that's looked at differences in mothers and fathers of children with autism in our country. But one study that was conducted in Asia found, looking at mothers of children who are autistic and mothers of children who are hearing impaired, found that mothers of autistic children had significantly higher levels of maternal burnout. And those where they categorized their autism symptom severity as more moderate or severe, they had higher levels of burnout as well. And I think one interesting aspect is in this study, they looked at differences between physical and psychological burden. And parents of hearing impaired children largely suffered from psychological burden alone, whereas parents of children who are autistic were experiencing more of that physical exhaustion that I was talking about, as well as the psychological part. So for providers, I won't spend too much time on this in the interest of time, but for providers, there's two measures now that can help screen for burnout in clinical practice. And one is included here and will be included in the handout that's provided. But this gets at 4 different types of burnout. So exhaustion in the parental role, contrast in parental self, which really measures the extent to which a parent has experienced a change in their parenting, which can be really telling. And then the feelings of being fed up that I mentioned. So I really can't take being a parent anymore. And then emotional distancing. So I do what I'm supposed to do for my child, but I really can't do anything more. And then it also yields a total burnout. And this can be helpful to identify, what a parent is currently experiencing. And then as I talk about later, some of the treatment or recommendations can be tailored if we have more of an idea of what a parent is experiencing. So I've talked so far about the risks and the consequences for burnout. And I really think it's equally, if not more important, to talk about the factors that buffer the effects of burnout. And so one of which is parental resilience, and this will be a main focus in the parent panel coming up. But we define parental resilience as the capacity of parents to deliver competent, quality parenting despite the adverse personal, family, and social circumstances that they're facing. And so the protective factors of resiliency may be social connectedness or feeling competent in their role as a parent. And then risk factors are similar in terms of poor psychological functioning or having children with behavioral problems that lead to the development, and these two combined lead to the development and maintenance of resiliency related to the parenting role. So there's a lot of research on resiliency generally, but not a lot is known about parenting resiliency in particular, which is why I've been really interested in this and think it's especially important. So again, very limited research and knowledge that we know about parents of autistic children. But one study examined a group of parents with kids with autism and found that higher levels of resilience related to lower potential parenting stress, which is not surprising. And I think a really positive outcome of this is that parents of children with autism really perceive themselves as moderately resilient to adversity. And so they felt like they were competent and able to handle the stress or the day-to-day difficulties that they were facing. And then in a study that looked at parents of typically developing children and children with Down syndrome, as well as autistic children, there were comparable levels of resilience across the 3 groups. So although parents may be experiencing greater difficulties and higher levels of stress, they really were able to still perceive themselves as moderately able to overcome adversity in the parenting role. So again, I won't spend too much time on this, but for providers in the audience, this can also be a really helpful tool to screen for resiliency. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but this measure yields knowledge of child's characteristics, which is a type of resiliency. So how confident does a parent feel like they understand their child's strengths and areas of challenge? Do they feel like they understand what their child is best suited for? Are they able to support their child? Things of that nature. And then perceived social supports for the parent. So do they have someone to talk to? Do they feel like they have people to support their child in the future? Things of that nature. And then positive perception of parenting. So I value my child. I can do things that my child needs, those types of things. So I'll move into the study that I mentioned that I conducted throughout the pandemic. And so the title of the study was Parental Burnout in Mothers and Fathers of Children with and Without Autism Spectrum Disorder During COVID-19. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but one of my main goals of this study was to include in equal numbers of mothers and fathers, because so much of the work that we do tends to only include mothers. And just given that we know there are differences in parenting experiences, I felt like it was really important to include both perspectives. And so the goal of this study was to look at resiliency and burnout and the differences between parents of typically developing children and parents of autistic children. And so I ended up having 185 participants. And I think one of the most interesting findings was in terms of how parents were reporting their child's behaviors. And so parents in the autistic group felt 70% of them described the pandemic as a very challenging time, whereas only 40% or so in the typically developing group. And then more than half of parents described their child's behaviors as more intense and more frequent, where it was 20% or less of parents of typically developing children. So I think as providers, a lot of what we heard from parents throughout the pandemic was just how challenging of a time it was for a number of reasons. And so I think thinking about not just the changes in the world, but also how it impacted children's behavior was really important as well. So I looked at the different types of burnout and found that across the board, parents of autistic children were experiencing significantly higher burnout in all 5 areas. Not surprising. However, I think one of the most surprising findings was that fathers reported significantly higher levels of burnout in the autistic group than mothers. And so, as I mentioned before, we have thought that fathers tend to burn out more quickly than mothers and may be more vulnerable to parenting responsibilities. And so most studies have found in the past that mothers are reporting higher levels than fathers. But in this study and in this time period, at least in this sample, fathers were reporting significantly higher emotional distancing from their children, and then higher levels of exhaustion and feeling fed up in their parenting role. So an interesting finding. I won't spend too much time on this, but I did look at some of the sociodemographic factors and see kind of in terms of age and income and education, if there were differences in who was experiencing the higher level of burnout. In fathers of older children who were experiencing more challenging behaviors were experiencing the greatest level of burnout, whereas mothers of children generally with behavioral problems were more burnout. And then mothers who were working during the pandemic and reported that they were highly educated and more financially secure were actually more emotionally distant and more fed up. And this may have been because lots of people were working from home. And so mothers who were balancing their job as well as caretaking and teaching and all of those things may have been feeling even more distance and fed up in their role. So I think going into parental resilience, one of the really positive findings was that there were no differences at all between mothers or fathers in the typically developing group or in the autistic group in terms of their positive perception of parenting. So across the board, parents were reporting that they had a positive feeling about their parenting. However, fathers in both the ASD group and the TD group reported lower levels of knowledge of their child's characteristics than mothers. And this is not necessarily totally surprising, given a lot of research shows that mothers spend more time with their children than fathers. But I think it's really important in thinking about how we include fathers, how fathers are feeling about their parenting role. And then they are also experiencing lower levels of social support. And this can be impactful as well, and I'm sure will come up in the parenting panel. So quickly taken together, the findings shed light on how parents' experiences with and without autism differed during the pandemic. And I think really highlights the importance for people like me as clinicians to really think about how we can increase our knowledge and support for parents in general, but especially fathers. And thinking about how we can assess or measure parents' level of functioning and their behavior related to the parenting role. And then, maybe most importantly, like I said, despite these extreme challenges, participants exhibited resilience in their role and acceptance of their children and positivity about their parenting role. And so really the overarching goal for me was that we continue to delve deeper into parents' unique experiences and that we can continue to tailor supports and promote long-term outcomes for children with autism and their families. So I'm going to transition now from the literature and my research to sharing some thoughts on how this relates to clinical work and can be helpful for parents. So given my findings in other studies, I've really tried to take some time to reflect on how, as clinicians, we may be able to be more cognizant and aware of unique experiences and then slightly adjust our mechanisms or treatment strategies to better meet the individual needs of a parent or family. And I'm going to highlight some of these considerations here, and then also talk about, from a parent's perspective, how it can be really hard to voice some of these concerns or talk about burnout or their own mental health. And so just some recommendations on how that can be conveyed to providers. So I think one of the main things for providers is taking the time to stop and really listen. And so, of course, there are times when we have more time than others, or, we're rushed, or we can't pay attention to nonverbal cues or small comments. But given that it can be hard for parents to talk about these things, I think it can be really helpful to try to listen and provide that open space. And think about, are we asking parents to do things that they can reasonably take on and handle at this given moment? And so thinking too, in terms of, as we saw in my study, some parents feel more confident in their knowledge about their child's diagnoses or their strengths and areas of challenge. And so thinking about ways that we can provide support or education to help increase feelings of parental efficacy, and especially for fathers, increasing that confidence, because that can have lasting impacts in terms of level of burnout or stress that parents are experiencing. And then I think lastly, there's many times when, as providers, we're thinking about a treatment isn't going as well as we had anticipated, or a parent, it's feeling like, I just can't manage all that this therapist is asking. Could be a reward chart or mindfulness or whatever it may be. And I think it's really important to think about what is underlying that difficulty. Like I said, are we asking parents to do too much given in this moment? Are they experiencing a lot of burnout? Might the conversation where we as therapists felt like we explained this really clearly, maybe it wasn't clear enough. And so thinking about, as providers, what may be getting in the way. And then from a parent's perspective, if you're experiencing something where it's hard to follow through, thinking through what may be getting in the way and how that can be conveyed to the provider to then get the support that you need. I do a lot of assessment or diagnosis of autism and other considerations. And so I think when we're providing feedback following diagnostic evaluations, that is a really important part of the resiliency related to knowledge of a child, and how, as a provider, really thinking about what's important for parents to know, what's most important for the parent. And sometimes we may think that we have an idea of what a parent wants to know, but I think what a parent experiences at home versus what a parent experiences in a clinic can be quite different. And so taking the time as the provider to really ask what a parent is hoping to get out of it, where they are with things, depending on level of burnout or stress in that moment, they may or may not be open to talking about certain topics. And so offering or asking and setting the tone that wherever the parent is in that moment is totally valid and acceptable. And I think too, thinking about mothers and fathers or multiple caregivers, it can be really burdensome for a caregiver to be present and hear a diagnosis or get feedback. And then it's on that caregiver to then relay the information to the rest of the team or to the rest of the family. And so thinking about if there are ways to include as many caregivers as possible to reduce that burden on one person. And then lastly, thinking about recommendations. And we often, as clinicians, want to provide all of the recommendations and all of the possible next steps. But for parents who are experiencing more burnout or other stressors in their life, it can be most helpful to think about the priority recommendations or highlight the top 3 next steps or ways to contact support rather than giving it all at once. So in these next 3 slides, I'm going to talk about tips that can be provided to parents if you're a provider or that parents may find useful themselves. And this comes primarily from Hill, who's done a lot of work in this area as well. And so she talks about how reduction in the overload of stimulation. So there can be a lot for parents, especially during the pandemic, but at any time, there's a lot of noise, a lot of demands, a lot of need for multitasking. And so any amount of time that can be taken alone, short timeouts can be really important to decrease depletion or sensitization. So closing a door, closing your eyes, focusing on breathing, even if it's for 2 minutes in the car, when they're rarely alone, can be really helpful. And she also talks about how, as parents, we never clear the lists of tasks. There is always something. Even as things are being checked off, kids are creating new tasks. And so she really emphasizes for parents who are experiencing this level of exhaustion to really try to prioritize sleep, even if it's a short amount of sleep. But that sleep, she recommends sleep's moved up on the list and other tasks can be moved down when possible. And then thinking about including kids in calming activities. So for any parent, but especially parents of young children, people recommend a yoga class or a massage, and that feels impossible. There's not time, financial burden, things of that nature. And so she recommends including kids in downtime activities. So stretching on the floor with your kids while they're playing Monopoly, or having kids, while you're lying down, walk on your back as a playful massage, to try to include kids, but also allow yourself some of that restful time. I talked about how one of the side effects of burnout is that parents may disengage. And so parents can report loving their kids, but also not finding joy. And so focusing on physical human touch is a recommendation that she has. So hugs, cuddling, anything like that. And then picking a hobby and including your kids. So parents are often focused on their kids' at school activities and then neglect their own interests. And so can be helpful to bring some vitality back into day-to-day by doing things parents love, but also including their children. And then mindfully observing their kids. And I think this is something that Kristen may bring up, but instead of using every minute of the day to get something done or check something off the list, but maybe finding 5 minutes to sit down and observe your child, savoring the moment, thinking about their growth, those types of things rather than focused on what needs to come next. And then lastly, tips for inadequacy. This is a central part of burnout and feeling like you're never doing enough or what you do is not good enough. And so parents can be really harsh critics of themselves. And so practicing self-compassion can really help to manage the stress of parenting. Being psychologically flexible can be really hard, but is associated with more positive parenting practices and was especially found to be helpful during the pandemic. So Hill recommends parents choose what matters most to them in their parenting. So again, kind of a priority list of what's most important in my parenting role and consistently turning towards that value as a guide when they begin to feel ineffective. And then that piece of social support that, again, I talked about, fathers especially have reported lower levels of social support, but trying to find ways in the community or in a family where parents can have social support and an outlet. So I want to be mindful of time, but I just did want to comment on a few examples from my clinical work where I feel like the parent-provider collaboration when parental burnout or lower levels of resiliency have been really impactful or important. And so I think parents consistently have shared that it can be really challenging at times to share their emotions or struggles related to their own mental health with providers, especially parents who are feeling a pressure to be perfect or do everything. And so I've had multiple instances where I have picked up on short statements or short comments that have really indicated to me that there are other potentially more important factors or stressors that are going on in a family's life. And so I think in these situations, I've really tried to go from focusing more on the child's therapy or teaching a child a word or the play-based therapy in really providing an open space for that caregiver to really open up and share their own experiences. And so, you know, a caregiver has said to me, like, finally someone is listening, or no one ever stops to ask how I am. And I think that that can be a really difficult place for caregivers, as well as lead to some of this increased burnout when we're paying so much attention to the child's behavior or growth without really incorporating the parent's mental health. So often these conversations can lead to reevaluation of goals, resetting priorities, and then also really validation of, for a parent or caregiver, that not everything needs to be done at once. You don't have to do every single therapy, but really validating to them that, you know, they can let things go and prioritize themselves when necessary or when they're in a more challenging time period. Similarly, parents have shared with me at times, like, this is really overwhelming. I'm just so tired, but I have to keep going. And again, this can be helpful for parents to really think about what is their own list of priorities, and if there's one thing that they want to change or one thing that they can focus on, that can be the priority for a period of time where they kind of develop more of this resiliency and focus on themselves. And I do a lot of play-based therapy or involving parents in sessions. And so on days when parents are really tired, it's giving them permission that they can sit out. They can take that time to themselves. And that can actually be more beneficial to the child and the parent than pushing themselves through and just keep going. And I think this comes up a lot of parents feeling like, I'm concerned that you aren't seeing what I see at home, or a child is behaving in a different way in the clinic. And so this can lead to parents and providers having different priorities or different goals. And so I think it's always really helpful as providers to think about or asking, is your child presenting today as they do at home? And if not, how is it different? And this also is important that caregivers at home see a child differently and may have a different view on priorities. And so getting as many perspectives as you can as to how people are seeing things and what different caregivers' goals are can be really helpful. And then also continuously bringing our intervention work back to parents' goals and priorities, I think can be really useful. So for parents, when they don't feel like their child is acting in the way that they do, or they're not seeing things the same way as the provider, it can be really useful to voice that, as hard as it may be. And so just to wrap up, conclusions, burnout can impact any type of parent, but parents of children with autism and other behavioral emotional challenges are at higher risk. As I've mentioned, fathers may burn out more quickly. And so as clinicians, we should really pay special attention to fathers' knowledge and awareness and social support. Parental burnout may impact our work in both diagnostic assessment and treatment. And being aware of and having slight adjustments in our clinical work when we sense burnout may really increase positive outcomes with parents, children, and families as a whole. And then this will be included in the handout, but just a list of Colorado parenting resources that can be useful. So I'll stop sharing and hand it over to Kristen and the panel.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much, Courtney. That was a really just such an important presentation, and I think gets to the core of our experience as families. And I have a great group with us today. We have Carol Phillips, Maria Dwyer, and Nate Miller, who are all parents of autistic children. And I think, and myself as well, I have 19-year-old triplets, all of whom were diagnosed with autism as toddlers and then developed a variety of additional diagnoses as they got older. I think one of the things that we all have in common on this panel today is that we have children who have experienced challenging behavior and who have experienced mental health challenges. And we engage in a variety just as human beings, but as parents of families like ours, in a lot of maybe what I would consider maladaptive coping strategies, as well as really positive coping strategies to deal with burnout. And I'm really excited to hear from everybody today. So what I'd like to do is just have everybody introduce their families and themselves, and then talk a little bit about, let's just introduce ourselves first, and then we'll get into some questions. So Carol, why don't you go first?
I'm happy to. My name is Carol Phillips, and My husband and I have two boys. My 19-year-old son has autism and bipolar, and my 17-year-old son has ADHD. And we have been on this journey for 16 years. Anything else?
That's good for now. How about you, Maria?
I'm Maria, and it's great to see all the people on here. I'm so curious, the parents who are on here, the ages of your children. But Nate and I are, we parent together our son Brady, and we are actually unique in that we co-parent really well. We are divorced, and we have a 15-year-old son. He was diagnosed with ASD at about 8 years old. There were a lot of other diagnoses prior to that, and then we finally got some diagnostic clarity. We also have a neurotypical child who is 13. And yeah, so we've been on the roller coaster with our son for 15 years. Nate, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered it, Maria. You guys can hear me, correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you.
Thank you.
That's
yeah, we
great.
can get. Yep. Go ahead.
We'll get to the heart of it. I know all of us have experienced burnout. I know I have, and I know all of you personally, so I'm pretty sure that you have as well. I want to talk a little bit about some of those experiences you've had where things have been really challenging and you've felt those elements of burnout, ways that you engaged in things that just didn't work really well, and then ways in which you engaged in things that ended up being very helpful in that component of resilience.
I can share. I can get started, Kristen, and share maybe some things that haven't worked so well. Yeah, I think I know personally I tend to kind of focus in the like focusing on the present is never a bad thing. However, when you're focusing in on kind of just trying to get through a day, and sometimes especially later in the day when you've had a long day, or maybe you've worked, and then you need to care for our son in our case, and give him the attention that he requires and needs. It's sometimes you're always your best self, and it takes a toll, especially over a span of a week or so. And I think being somehow trying to now to kind of spin that into a more positive note, constantly reminding yourself that it's not about me personally. It's not about it's not even about him, because he is who he is. It's really about the situation that we're in, and trying to always bring to light that he's trying his best as well. And it's our role as parents to unconditionally love and support, and just that kind of constant reminder that it's not intentional. It's difficult, but it's not intentional, and he's trying his hardest, and we need to give grace in that area.
That's great, Nate. And I think you have to be so intentional, right? And that's kind of exhausting, and in continually reminding yourself, this is a really difficult situation that we're in, and our kids are doing the best they can. I struggle with wanting to numb out a lot. And so I will kind of not be fully present because it's too hard. And I'll end up reading a lot or not paying a lot of attention to what's going on in front of me, because I feel like I need that distance. And I'm wondering how you guys stay present, or do you numb out, or do you try and kind of emotionally distance when things get really challenging?
Yeah, I can speak to that. Over the 15 years, I think I've numbed out with a lot of different things, depending on the cycle and what I'm doing recently. And, and numbing out is not, helpful. It might be helpful in that moment, but to the overall mental health hasn't been helpful. So, I think I've numbed out, especially during pandemic when Courtney was sharing, like during pandemic struggles, I numbed out with Netflix. Like I'd isolate, socially distance from the kids and go to my room and binge watch Netflix. And then I've also historically, when the kids were younger, I would numb out with exercise. I would avoid with exercise. Recently, it's while we say sleep is a really good thing, I've been numbing out with sleep to avoid. So napping or just to get that relief and that escape has not been the most healthy mentally. I think what it has been helpful is therapy for me personally, to specifically talk about my frustrations and my worries and my concerns with a therapist. And this is the tricky part, is we don't have a lot of therapists who are trained to support parents of kids with autism. So I've gone through some therapists where they'll talk about everything, but they don't really know how to support with that. So that's been a hard thing to find. But even if a therapist, I'll say to them, you don't need to be an expert in autism, like you just need to listen to me. Like that's all I need, is like to vent and process like some better coping skills. It's okay that you're not an expert in ASD and you don't necessarily understand. But that therapy has been one really helpful coping strategy for me.
That's great, Maria. I also engage in therapy and it is really hard to find somebody who understands. And in addition to listening, I think also validating that you're not a terrible parent because you're numbing out or you're burnt out or you're engaging in some of these maladaptive coping strategies, that you're doing your best you can as a human, and you're doing better than you think you are. I can say from experience with all three of you that you're amazing parents. But it's an impossible thing to, and to Courtney's point in one of her slides, she said that that mothers tend to, especially, and Nate, maybe you also feel this way, really try and be a perfect parent, right? That we put a ton of pressure on ourselves to always have the answer and do the right thing. And I think one of my coping strategies was to be calm all the time, like present really calm, but it's really like a total, show on the inside, right? I'm really freaking out. I'm having a lot of anxiety. I'm shoving my feelings down so that I can appear to be very calm. And I've been using that strategy for a long time, and it's great for the kids. It's not so great for me and for my health. So Carol, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on some of these ideas.
Well, I really related to Courtney talking about how transition relates to resources. Because currently we're going through the transition process with my son, which is overwhelming to say the least. And a lot of my burnout is coming from the fact that the resources that I need are not available and the support isn't. And so, and for me, one of my coping strategies is literally, I'm just shoving the tasks away. I'm like, oh, I don't have to deal with that right now. I can't deal with that right now. I can't do it. And internally, it's causing a lot of stress because I know it needs to happen, but I just don't have it in me to do it. And so that, that's based on, like we talked about, lack of resources. The flip side of that is, when it builds up to a certain level, I'm like, all right, I'm going to attack this. I'm going to go research 100 things and I'm going to go to 1 million websites. And you're like, okay, wait a minute. Now I've burnt myself out the other way. And so really, I loved Courtney's point about, smaller task lists. to help manage those large, overwhelming, I mean, we're going to go through getting resources for our kids our entire lives. It's going to be something we're going to, you know, have to take on in a new capacity repeatedly, and how to smaller task lists can help that and give you a better coping mechanism for the overwhelming that you feel when you look at, you know, a huge project like that.
Thanks, Carol. I think too, recognizing that a lot of times challenging behavior or mental health issues can be very triggering for us as parents. Some of us have PTSD from previous experiences, when behaviors happened in the community, or something really challenging has happened within the family unit or extended family who have really struggled with our kids' particular challenges. We can tend to experience what I would refer to as some grief triggers when those things occur again. And I have to recognize when I'm having a pretty big feelings about something that might not appear to be a big deal, but it's triggering a lot of past experience. And to Nate's point, I think thinking about, you know, trying to stay present so that you're not thinking about what's happened before, and you're not lying in bed awake at night thinking about what's going to happen next. It's really, really helpful to stay in the present moment. And when I feel that grief trigger, I try and remind myself to stay in the present moment. And meds have helped me quite a bit. I'm just going to throw that in there for myself.
I do have registered PTSD from bipolar incidents. And I mean, it's valid. You know, it was some very serious, but the minute my kid isn't asleep by midnight, I'm done for the night. And I know it. And my husband does too. And he's really good at saying, you're off, I'm on, which is helpful.
Nate, do you have any other thoughts on maybe some differences in the way you've experienced burnout as a father? Thinking back to Courtney's kind of research and interest in those different responses, how do you think you have experienced and dealt with burnout and looked for ways to be resilient?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kristen. I was thinking about that as Courtney was going through kind of some of those results that were a little different for fathers. I mean, personally, I probably fall, I don't know what this says about me, but I probably fall more on the mother's trend. I mean, I'm a pretty involved parent, and always have been, and was kind of raised that way. So I don't necessarily see myself in all of those father categories, but that's just me. You know, I mean, I think it's a lot of what everybody's been saying. It's, you know, it's not only easier, and it's not always easy. And, you know, Carol made a good point about having to deal, you know, this isn't, you know, I think for many years, personally, I was kind of waiting for our son to be, quote, fixed, because I wanted to just fix it. And that's something that I've struggled a lot with, and maybe that's a more of a male trait. But you know, and so it even though I intellectually knew that this was a lifelong disability, and this is something we're going to be needing to deal with our entire lives, you know, it did take me quite a while to really kind of fully grasp that and understand that, you know, we can help teach him coping skills and help him to a certain extent, but this is really something that he's gonna need support with, you know, for as long as we're here. So, and that's pretty overwhelming to think about that, because especially when you're trying to get through day by day, you know, hurricanes and fires that are happening in probably in all of our homes. You know, it's tough to kind of think like, oh man, there's really no end to this. But you know, and I mean, I'm lucky as well to have Maria as a as a partner through all of this, because I think we really leverage each other because we're living very, the same experience. So we're able, so I'm lucky in that regard. But yeah, I'll stop rambling now, Kristen. That's a few additional thoughts there.
The only other thing I really just wanted to add is, and Nate touched on, him being thankful that he has me, and I equally feeling thankful that I have him, is, one coping strategy that is not helpful is isolation. And I think there is so much, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but when our son was younger, there's so much shame that I felt when my son would act out in public. So then I would want to isolate, or I would want to avoid. There's shame with talking to Nate's parents or my parents, because they have their, the grandparents have their opinions, or friends. And so my coping strategy was just to withdraw and isolate, and based on my own shame. And I think that is just the most toxic for me. But, on the flip side of that is finding, and it doesn't need to be going and telling everyone all of your business and your kids and all of that, but having one trusted friend, your partner, a therapist, the school, someone who you can really be yourself and talk about the struggles honestly without any shame, because we are, just like our kids are doing the best that they can, we're doing the best that we can. And that idea of like trying to achieve perfectionism, like that just has to go out the window. So that's just the last thing I will add to that.
I
Thanks,
agree,
Maria.
I
Go
think
ahead, Carol.
in reality, for me, you know where I'm going, Kristen. I know you do.
I know where you're going.
The best coping mechanism for me has been peer support. I am a firm believer that parents who are on this journey are the best support for other parents. You find your tribe, and the tribe, you can talk about things to a group of people who've been on this journey without judgment. And I think that is just the most valuable piece that I've come across. And for me, another huge part of that is if you're talking to other parents, a lot of times who have been on this journey might not be as far along as you are. Humor is a great way to open the door for the conversation, because I can tell you all about my kid running naked through Target. It happened. It is. But the fact that I can present it and say, oh my God, we're, known in our Target, and I can make it a lighter conversation, opens the door for other people to share their experiences. And I think that's valuable for everybody. Every parent deserves someone who can listen to them and share their journey and support them with no judgment.
Thank you, Carol. I think that, and Maria, I think that social support is, of course, huge. It's one of the biggest positive predictors of a positive mental health outcome for families. And it's the hardest thing for us to do. Maria, just like you, I did a lot of isolating when my kids were younger. And I also felt a lot of shame and a lot of judgment. And I got really wrapped up in those feelings and didn't know how to help. I think a lot of people in my life would have loved to be more supportive, but they didn't know how. And I couldn't help them know how, because I was feeling too many challenging feelings myself. But yeah, I think that social support, humor is huge. I think that also leads us into thinking about how it helped me when I started really having some connections with other families who are having our journey, was really thinking about our kids in a way that wasn't focused on their deficit or focused on their challenges. It was really learning to accept them for who they were. For a really long time, I couldn't see the beauty of my kids. I could only see the autism. I could only see the Tourette's. I could only see the anxiety. And really, my kids are beautiful, kind, funny people. They're great people to know. And I think learning how to have some humor and see the other pieces of them has been huge for us. And one thing Courtney said about how we can involve our kids in our own coping strategies. I started a podcast with a very close friend of mine, and it's called You Don't Want to Hug, right? And we involved our kids in the podcast. So at the end of every episode, our kid, whatever the topic of the episode is, our kids weigh in on their thoughts, because nothing about us without us is something we really believe in. And it was so fascinating to see how much the kids loved this project. And really, it brought us kind of together in this, like, we're kind of crazy. Like, we've had this really different experience than other families. And we're able to look at it together in a way that we never have before. So I really love that idea of finding ways to bring your kids into those activities that make you feel more whole as a human.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kristen. I mean, I think that's something that we try to do as well, is even though we're generally not interested in the same things that our son is, but just designating some specific time every day to do whatever it is he wants to do has really I think helped him, and also helped our relationships with him. And I just have a couple other things that I'm thinking about since we started this. One is this, that just, we talk about having our kids kind of, not only us having that kind of social, that social help, or however everybody else worded it a lot better than I do, but that, and having our kids, and I don't know what the ages are of some of the other parents on here, but having them in the right school setting, for us, kind of changed our lives. If there's one big event that really put us on a much better trajectory, it was we relocated to Denver to attend the Joshua School. So to attend a school that's specialized and understands what it means to be autistic and to teach autistic kids. And we really struggled for years in some public school systems trying to get the right things in place for him. So that was kind of a critical point in our life that really did help. The other thing I was thinking of too, and I know Maria mentioned that we have a she's about 1.5 years younger than our son, but we have a neurotypical daughter. And one of the things that I know we struggle with a lot is we have to give so much attention to our son that we try to make kind of the same accommodations for our daughter as well, because he does require so much time and energy that we've made it, and we've been better at it than at sometimes than other times, but we make a very conscious effort to give her that same amount of attention and and do special things with her that maybe we can't do as a family because of the difficulties with our son. So that was the other thing I just wanted to kind of call out.
That's great, Nate. Thanks for sharing those pieces of that experience. I do think school makes a huge difference, and then really trying to capitalize on any opportunity to spread that attention to other family members, hugely important. I want to open up the floor to people who might have questions in our last few minutes here together. I think people can either unmute and shout out, or can put it in the chats. A few of the things people have said, Megan, thanks for your comment about loving Carol's idea about tapping out a parent, which is huge. We do that at the Joshua School all the time, where we tap each other out when we're working with our students. But I think in families, I think it's huge too, when you are co-parent recognizes that you've hit your limit and that maybe you don't have the skill set for this particular situation. My husband can listen to my son talk about Pokemon for a really long time, and it makes me slip into a coma immediately. So usually tap out when we need to talk about some of those special interests. But what are some questions people have? So Carrie has said, do any of you have suggestions for caregivers of young adults, 19 to early 20s, when they no longer have the structure and support of schools? Any tips on employment? Ooh, Carrie, I'm right there. I am right there with you and struggling with that too. Carol, you would be great at this question.
Yes, I have done a little bit of work with the employment as part of the transition process. And I would say that the best resource really is, it technically should start in the schools because they should start talking about employment when they are still in high school, talking about what they want to do and kind of their ideas. But SWAP, which is the School to Work Alliance program, is a part of the Division of Vocational Rehab. And if you go on the Division of Vocational Rehab website, there's a request for information there. You can get some more information on that. And SWAP is a great resource for starting the employment journey, doing some pre-transition work with your kiddos to start to understand what employment would look like and what the opportunities are. And they can get started there. That would be my suggestion.
And I would say 2 of my children have gone away to college, and one of my children is living with us and was doing the transition program in Littleton and doing some classes at Arapahoe Community College. Really struggled with the transition program and trying to allow him some self-determination and deciding that that wasn't a good fit for him. But it has been really hard for us to find the structure needed to kind of keep him going at the same pace he was. So Carrie, I understand your challenge with that. Carrie also said she works with kinship caregivers, mostly grandparents raising kids and young adults. And one of the young adults is struggling to keep a job because of changes with his work schedule, coworkers lying to him at work, etc. Hard to balance for caregiver, giving young adult independence and providing guidance. So hard. That is a really hard balance. We're finding that too, in really helping Graham determine, he really would love to have a job. He really can only work for about an hour and then he's all done. And that doesn't work really well in work settings. So building up that independence and providing enough guidance when they're young adults and might not be as open to hearing from their parents what they need to do.
I agree with that. And I think that's part of it is, as parents, there's a time to start building a team around. That's what we're trying to do with Garrett right now, is build a team other than Josh and I, other adults, other family members, friends. We even have someone on his team who he went to high school with, who's just a friend, but a neurotypical friend, to try to get information to him in ways that isn't coming from mom and dad. It seems to be heard better. I don't know.
So true. I think one of the last things Courtney said was kind of validating, if providers can validate families letting things go. I think, the team, the transition team, being really supportive of Graham leaving transition and just recognizing that maybe we're just done with this amount of intervention, and recognizing and allowing Graham to make that decision for himself, but also giving us permission as parents to do that. Any other final thoughts or questions or comments?
I think someone's raising their hand.
Ooh, I can't see. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Zephrine, and I have 3 children on the spectrum, twin daughters who are 13 and a son who'll be turning 15. I'll just throw this out here and I'll drop it in the comments if it works for someone. TAC, Teaching the Autism Trades Community, is a program my children have been a part of, and I really appreciate Danny and Becky and all the parents are proud of it, who are a part of it. That's one thing, but just I want to thank all of you for normalizing my life, naked running children, all the therapies, all the combined diagnoses, all those things. So for me, I'll be honest, at first I was like, I don't need to hear anybody else's story because I already know. But what I realized is I'm so isolated in my own head that you normalized, not normalized, but helped me understand why I was doing, or my husband and I are burnt out, all those things. So I think that's the number one, is getting rid of the shame so that we can go towards the resilience, because this is just such a kismet that I signed up and I made it, because we definitely are in that space and that transition. So just that part of this being a more normal conversation for parents who are coming to this stage, really, I don't even know how much anxiety you probably brought down for me today, but I just want to thank you for normalizing that and the resources. And so I'll drop my information. Of course, I'm a very busy parent like everyone else, trying to do all the things, but if I can connect and help with other parents and young adults, it is worth it all. Because like y'all, I've been doing it for 15 years in 2 different states. So I get it. So thank you.
Thank you, Zephrine. Thank you so much for sharing that. It just makes our day to know that you feel connected and normalized those experiences and that shame and that anxiety and all of those things. TACT is wonderful. Brian also, Brian B mentioned that he would love to see more parents and autistic adults collaborate for community peer supports. I would love to see that. Great idea, Brian. And Preeti would like to know what advice we have for a parent who feels all their services are still too hard to access our child's ability. So really struggling, Preeti, I'm thinking you're saying that struggling to find providers who can really get to your child's abilities and strengths and be able to draw them out.
Yeah, I'll take a few minutes. But what my challenge feels like, whether it's day programs or employment related programs, like you guys mentioned, TACT, all seem to cater to if it's okay to say higher functioning, I don't know what the right way of phrasing these days is, for kids who are able to do more. So I've always wondered, what do parents do when you don't know what your child likes, what they want, what their interests are, and anything that's offered seems a little too beyond their capacity at this point.
Thanks, Preeti. I think that's a really important point. There's very few day treatment programs and adult programs that can adequately support our kids who have more challenging behaviors or for whom communication is more of a struggle. And we are, providers can really struggle to find out what those motivations are and what those interests are. I know Treeline Pass is one of those organizations that does have behavioral intervention support for adults, which is unusual. And hopefully that will grow in our community as we see, that we need to focus more on giving our kids and our adults who are autistic enviable lives, not just support for challenges, but what are their hopes and dreams and how are they engaging meaningfully in their communities. I'm going to take one last question from Catherine's had her hand up, and then I think we'll be out of time.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I unfortunately, I had to miss the first half of this, but I've got a 4.5-year-old with an ASD diagnosis, and so I'm really early on in the journey. And one of the things, that's talked so much about is self-regulation, and both mainly for the kid, but then you hear in parallel advice that, you know, the children are mirrors of our own moods and emotions. And so I'm always surprised when I work with an OT that they don't really zero in on the regulation of the parent and the parent's emotional state. And so I guess I don't know a lot of resources that really focus on parents coping. I mean, this was great, but as far as like ongoing tools, support networks, I know that I heard therapy mentioned, but specifically therapy with therapists with experience around this sort of scenario. So I was just wondering if you guys knew of anything, any programs, online books, resources or lists of therapists that really kind of focus on the parent in this unique situation, but also how specifically the parent, helping the parent, having the parent regulate themselves can like affect the children and their emotional state. Does that make sense?
It does, Catherine. Thank you for your question. And just in the couple seconds we have left, I will say that there is a lot of good research that correlates kind of parents' level of anxiety with their children's level of anxiety and emotional regulation. One of the things that I've had experience with is trying to find therapists who do ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a kind of a form of applied behavioral analysis for these pieces of emotional regulation. I wish more OTs focused on that kind of integration therapy for emotional regulation for the whole family unit. It's always great to find people who do that. I think Tracy Stackhouse at Developmental FX is somebody who focuses on that type of intervention. And she has a podcast as well that speaks to the issues of the family unit as a whole. I don't know if anybody else has any other suggestions, but we can follow up with more resources to this community. I just want to thank our panel so much for being so open and honest and having a great conversation. And thanks to Courtney for her presentation.
Thanks to all of you for being here.